Well, good evening, everybody. First of all, let me thank, on behalf of our school, International House, for being such a great partner and for having one of the few really significant public spaces on the campus that is commensurate in its dignity with the stature of some of our best speakers. So thank you very much for being a good steward of this important resource for the university. Tonight, we are having yet another lecture in the series enabled by the Pacific Leadership Fellows Program, which is part of the Center on Global Transformation at the school. The Pacific Leadership Fellows Program is designed to bring distinguished leaders from all sectors, whether it's government, private, or nonprofit, to spend time in residence in San Diego, hosted by the school, so that they can both get to know and interact with people throughout the region, but just as importantly, interact with our students and faculty in a way that enriches the educational experience of our students, provides a kind of practical set of insights and feedback for our faculty, and we hope builds, in a sense, the brand and reputation of San Diego as an internationally engaged center in the Pacific. Now, the boundary terms of the Pacific Leadership Fellows Program, of course, as you might suspect from the title, is that we especially focus on the Pacific, Asia, and the Americas as a source of fellows, but in keeping with the broader sense of the gift from the Jacobs family that makes this possible, we also reach out periodically to leaders from Europe and elsewhere around the world. In the series of Pacific Leadership Fellows, we always have people who are of true stature, but some, as they say, are better known public brands than others. And tonight, I don't want to be the person in the way of getting to our speaker, because I literally think he doesn't need an introduction. Bob Hormats, of course, most recently served in the Obama administration as Undersecretary for Economics at the State Department. He did a prior stint in government as the Deputy U.S. Trade Representative. He has served as the Vice Chair of Goldman Sachs International and now Vice Chair of Kissinger and Associates. Prior to that, he made either the brilliant choice or the slightly misguided use of his time to get a PhD in international affairs from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, so that he brings to bear a full range of academic, private sector, and public sector experiences when he offers his thoughts. His writings have been interesting and diverse, including a wonderful book on Abraham Lincoln and the world economy, which I highly recommend to you as a step back into thinking about the transformation of the United States as a rising world power. Bob tonight has agreed to talk about a subject much on the mind of Americans, which is our engagement with Iran in terms of the economic dimension of that engagement. We're very, very fortunate to have him. He's been a terrific Pacific Leadership Fellow, wildly popular with our students and faculty, and I know at the end of this evening, wildly popular with the few of you who aren't already friends of his. Bob, thank you for being with us. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Peter. I want to thank you and Susan for organizing this and for your warm welcome that you've provided and for the warm welcome that many in this community have provided. I'm particularly happy to see some very good friends from various parts of the country, and in fact, all the way from Canada have come here today to participate in this event. So, and from New York and various other parts of the world. So thank you all very much for coming and for participating and for the wonderful friendship and hospitality that you've shown me. It's been really a great way of becoming part of this community, because when you have friends here and you can develop your friendships along with the academic and intellectual experience of the university, it makes it a very complete experience. So I want to thank my friends for their wonderful hospitality and friendship, and thank you, Peter and Susan, for organizing this terrific event. I've been asked by Peter, and I think it was an interesting choice since I've been working on this for a little while, but this sort of speeded up my probing of the subject, and that is, what is Iran going to look like after the sanctions, and what will the sanction lifting mean for American investors, for foreign investors, and for the Iranians themselves? The sanctions were lifted officially on January 16th of this year under what was negotiated last year, which was called the Joint Comprehensive Economic Partnership, JCPOA. And what that did was to say, if Iran complies, as verified by the International Atomic Energy Agency, then the West will agree, the P5+1, the Security Council members and other members of the UN would agree to lift certain economic sanctions. And I use the word certain advisedly, as you'll see, because not all the sanctions were lifted, only the sanctions that related to the nuclear program. It turns out, however, that the US has really since 1979, but particularly during the Clinton administration, imposed sanctions on Iran for a variety of other things that have to do with human rights issues, that have to do with aiding terrorism, that have to do with ballistic missile tests, so that many American sanctions, and I'll describe this in a few minutes, still exist. So that, in fact, what's happened is that while sanctions have been lifted by almost every other country, for the most part, Iranians will not be able, Americans will not be able to deal with Iran. Americans will not be able to trade with Iran and not be able to invest in Iran, except where there are certain exceptions carved out under the JCPOA, which were agreed upon in advance. The advantage of the removal of the sanctions for Iran is that Iran will now be able to sell its oil freely in world markets. Even though the price is down, they'll still have the opportunity to do that. They will get money that was blocked in other countries, mostly China, Japan, South Korea, and India, which is about $100+ billion, although some of that's already committed, so they'll probably only get really 40 or 50 billion that's usable, but nonetheless, they'll get more money. And they'll be able to trade with other countries, for the most part. With the United States in particular, however, the sanctions will, as I say, restrict how much trade and how much investment will be able to take place. So the narrative was that when the sanctions were removed, two things would happen. One, the Iranian economy would flourish. It would get all this money from oil and from the returned blocked assets. And in addition, it would be able to trade with other countries that it hadn't been able to trade with under sanctions. And for investors, there'd be a great opportunity to sell their products in Iran, either through investing in Iran, or if they're just involved in trade, selling to Iran. But it would create great opportunities for trade, great opportunities for business, and great opportunities for growth in Iran. But I think when you look deeper into the circumstances of Iran and the sanctions that remain, there are a lot of very complicated factors that are going to determine what happens over the next 6-12 months and beyond that. And that is that Iran is an extraordinarily complicated country. It was under the Shah. It's even more complicated now. In order to make intelligent business decisions, you have to understand the complicated politics of Iran, the complicated economics of Iran, the complicated social environment of Iran, and the history of this country, and the fact that it has a lot of issues with other countries, including the United States, but also in the region of the Middle East and the Persian Gulf. So it's not going to be clear sailing to domestic prosperity or clear sailing for foreign investors who decide they would like to invest in Iran. And one way of looking at it, just to get a sense of what Iran is as a country and how the economic situation is structured, you have to look at Iran in terms of two different governance structures. One of them looks like the governance structure of a normal state, a normal country, which is to say there's a president, there is a parliament called the Majlis, and there is a cabinet. So in many ways it looks like a normal country with many of the institutions that we're familiar with in the West. However, sitting above that structure is a very different structure, often competing with this traditional governance structure, which is based on institutions created after the Islamic Revolution. And there you have the supreme leader, you have a group called the Assembly or the Council of Experts, which determines who can run for the parliament and other groups, but particularly the parliament. And they very recently vetoed large numbers of reformers who wanted to run for the parliament. So you have elections, but who can run in the elections is constrained quite dramatically. You have the Revolutionary Guards that were set up, and they, in effect, parallel the army. There's a regular army and then the Guards. The Guards are much more inspired by revolutionary purposes. And then you have under the Guards something called the Besiege, which is a domestic group, which is where they go around making sure that you're wearing the right clothes or you're not saying things against the government or against the supreme leader in particular. And then you have the Kurds Force, which I think most of you have heard about, and they do operations in various parts of the world, including Syria, but not limited to Syria. So you have this revolutionary group inspired by revolutionary tenets. And then you have, in addition to that, a group that people have heard of a lot less called the Banyads. The Banyads are foundations. We would call them foundations. That's what it means in Farsi. But they do give out money to, for instance, families of soldiers who've been killed in the war, orphans, and poor people. They do a lot of very good charitable work. And in many Islamic countries, you have groups similar to this. But in Iran, they don't just do that. They own a very large portion of the business community in Iran. There are various estimates because Iran is a totally opaque country, so you really don't know how much they own. But perhaps 20, maybe 30% of the national wealth is controlled by the Banyads. And no one quite knows where the money goes. The money that doesn't go to charity, some of it goes back to the companies they own, and some of it, and there are rumors to this effect, go to political purposes and other purposes like supporting various groups abroad. And the Revolutionary Guard also has a major role in the economy. It owns something on the order of 30% of the economy, and it's owned either by the Guards as individuals or the Revolutionary Guard itself. They have a big engineering company that does a lot of big construction projects in Iran. So you see this sort of bifurcated system with one governance structure sitting on top of another and dominating the other, figuring out who does what and exactly what the relationship is on any given issue is very complicated. Just to give you one example, President Rouhani was in the United States during the UN meetings, and he gave various speeches. He met with a lot of business people and said, "You're welcome to invest in Iran." He went out of his way to tell American business people their investment in Iran was welcome. So he goes back to Iran, and the supreme leader then says, "We don't want any American investment at all because it will undermine the principles of the Islamic Revolution." The very next day, President Rouhani gives another speech saying, "I told the Americans specifically that we would like to have them invest in our country." So this gives you a sense of the ideological and the political differences between one level of government and another, or one government structure and another. It just really is sort of a precursor of what I'm going to talk about in a few minutes, but you have to understand this very complicated structure that the Iranians have. And you can imagine if you're a business person who wants to trade with Iran or invest there, where you have different groups with very different perspectives on investment or trade with the outside world. Now, the United States is a particular point of focus of the supreme leader for a lot of historical reasons. Other countries, like the Europeans and the Asians, come in for a lot less criticism, but certainly the United States is not the favorite country of the supreme leader, and he's going out of his way to say on repeated occasions how much he doesn't like the Americans and how much he doesn't want the Americans there and how much he doesn't want trade with the Americans or investment. So what's the situation for Americans or Europeans or others? The sanctions were lifted, as I say, on January 16th, but only in certain ways. And I think it's useful just quickly, there are reams of legal documents that explain in detail what sanctions were removed and what sanctions are not removed. And this is done by the Treasury Department with guidance from other parts of the government under what they call OFAC, or the Office of Foreign Assets Controls. The United States, for the most part, the government will continue to impose sanctions on Iran that prevent American companies from doing business with Iran. And just very briefly, the major exception under the JCPOA is that now airplane companies, Boeing in particular, will be able to sell to Iran. And if you're in the business of selling food or selling medical equipment or certain kinds of communications equipment, there has never been sanctions at all. Americans continue to sell food to Iran, medical supplies, diagnostic equipment, and certain kinds of communications equipment, because the idea was we want the Iranians to be able to communicate with one another more than they have been in the past, and also with foreigners. So those really haven't been changed at all. So the big change really is that the companies that make airplanes or airplane parts or airplane services can now sell to Iran. They can sell the products, they can sell their services, they can maintain airplanes. And this is in part because if we continue the sanctions on this sector, Airbus would have gotten all the business, but it's also a safety issue because Iran mostly has Boeing airplanes, and many of them are crashing or couldn't get spare parts. So it was done in part for commercial reasons, in part for safety reasons. So for most Americans, not much benefit to the removal of these sanctions. For the American subsidiaries abroad, it's a different matter. American subs abroad, if they make sure that there's a very clear line of delineation between their business abroad and their business in the United States, and if they make deals with Iran that are independent of their headquarters in the United States, and that has to be done more or less on a case-by-case basis, they can actually do business. So if they're in Europe, they can sell items made in Europe to the Iranians. So subs, American subs, will be able to do more business. And foreign entities, foreign companies in Europe or elsewhere will be completely lifted from their responsibilities under the UN sanctions, so they'll be able to sell in Iran in a very normal way, with two exceptions. And this is a complicating factor. One is that the United States has what's called a specially designated names list. And this list is a list of individuals or entities that have violated some American laws or executive orders. In other words, they're engaging in support for terrorism, like the Revolutionary Guard, or they're supporting the movement of the Kurds Force. There's an airline that does that. Or they're a bank that somehow provides money to revolutionary activities of various groups like Hezbollah. So there were 600 names or entities on this list. The US agreed to cut 400 of them out, but there's still 200 there. So if you're a foreign company and you deal with those 200 individuals or entities, then you're still subject to American sanctions. And the second is, and this is even more complicated, unless you have a special license from the Treasury, you cannot clear transactions with American banks, which in effect means, and we can go into detail, but it's relatively boring, in effect it means you cannot engage, unless you have a special license like Boeing would, you cannot engage in dollar transactions with Iran, because dollar transactions, the way the banking system in this world works, are cleared through American banks. If you had a few dollars somewhere, you could maybe use those, but for the most part, commercial transactions that are involving dollars won't happen. So if you want to do business, you have to use euros or Chinese renminbi or pound sterling or Swiss francs, not dollars. So even if you're an American subsidiary abroad, it specifically says you cannot use dollars. So this makes it very complicated, and obviously you have to do a lot of work to figure out how to do business in Iran. The next point, I think, is interesting from the point of view of investors, but also more from the point of view of the Iranian system, and that is, what does Iran look like economically today? And that involves the traditional economic issues. They have very high inflation. They have unemployment of something in the order of 20%. The banking system is in shambles because it didn't have access to SWIFT, which is the international information process that enables you to clear transactions around the world. Their companies are very poorly run. It's highly, highly opaque, so you have no idea of the ownership structure of virtually anything in Iran. And you have Revolutionary Guards and Banyads participating in ownership, but you don't know, because they don't publish their books. There are no 10Ks, nothing like this, so you don't really know who owns what and who has management responsibility over what. So it's a very complicated environment. First of all, the economy itself has had difficulties. And second, the structure, who owns what, how decisions are made, is extremely complicated and probably going to get worse. And these groups, the Revolutionary Guard and the Banyads, report to the supreme leader, not to the government. So even if the government did, as it has in the past, suggest there should be more transparency, there isn't, because the supreme leader is particularly happy to have this be a very opaque environment. So a dilemma for a potential investor is, who do you trade with? Who do you invest with? How do you do due diligence? Very difficult to do. And there are some private sector. In fact, there are many private sector companies, but it's very difficult to know what the ownership structure is. On the other hand, there's some enormous opportunities and positives in the Iranian economy. First of all, the biggest strength of Iran is not the fact that it has a lot of oil and gas, which of course it does, and that is a strength. The biggest strength of Iran are the people of Iran. I mean, you have a very highly educated workforce in Iran. You have more than half of all students study science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, the so-called STEMs, more than 50%. 70% of the students in those categories, particularly engineering and mathematics, are women, highly educated and very interested in playing a much greater role, by far the highest percentage in the Middle East or in almost any other country, including ours. The women really play a major role in the educational system and in this area. So, and there are a lot of very entrepreneurial people, because they've been cut off from a lot of sectors of the world economy. They've developed their own information technology companies, they've developed their own internet companies. 30 to 40% of Iranians use the internet, 30 to 40%. To give you one comparison, in Iraq, their neighbor, it's less than 10%. So you can get a sense that there's enormous talent there. It's very skilled talent, it's highly educated, excellent medicine. In fact, even during the sanctions, the NIH here had collaborative medical research with Iranian universities and Iranian research centers. So there's a lot of very high quality medicine as well. And the other is, it's a very diversified economy. It's not just a one-trick pony like some of its neighbors. Does sell oil, does sell gas, but it produces automobiles, it produces buses, it produces a lot of steel. It's a very diversified economy, far more diversified than any country in the Middle East, with the exception of Israel. It's the most diversified economy and the most technologically savvy. So this is a country with a lot of opportunities, which is why a lot of people want to invest there and go there and trade there. And they also have a thriving stock market. You have to worry a little bit because some of the companies listed on the stock market are also on the specially designated names list, so you don't want to be buying their stock. It's not a big issue for Americans since we can't buy their stock anyway, but if you're European, you buy their stock, you're also theoretically subject to American sanctions. There are also, and I think it's useful to think about it in this way, there are long-term benefits for trading and investing in Iran, and that is you have the opportunity to interact with younger Iranians, entrepreneurial Iranians, and the more you open the country up through trade and investment, over the medium term, there is at least a chance that that will strengthen the reformers. Certainly President Rouhani believes this. And there'll be more Iranians who have exposure to the outside world, and particularly younger people will have a chance to understand the outside world. And over a period of time, that might enhance the prospects of political change. Now, we shouldn't be overly optimistic this is going to happen in the near term, because in the near term, the mullahs, the clerics, the Revolutionary Guards have a lot of control over what happens. But it's not a monolith, and people would have said that about China 20 or 30 years ago, that it was not going to change, it was monolithic, and lo and behold, look what's happened to China now. So change is possible, but I don't think one can anticipate that it's going to happen right away. Now, for the Iranians, there are a number of decisions they have to make. The investors have to figure out who they want to invest with, who they want to trade with, how they do due diligence. They're going to have to understand the sanctions process very, very thoroughly before they make any decisions. And investors, certainly American ones, are very cautious, but Europeans also. They all need good lawyers. It's really a subsidy program for sanctions lawyers in this country and in Europe. But they're not the only ones who have to make tough decisions. The Iranians themselves have to make very tough decisions. And I'll just name a few of them. One is that while they're going to get a lot of money in the near term, it's not an economy that is going to be able to grow without a lot of reform. And the IMF repeatedly, which sends people there on a regular basis, has told them they have to make reforms of the banking system, they have to make reforms in governance of their companies, they have to make a lot of reforms, and they have to have a better environment for investment. And they have to particularly be able to protect intellectual property, protect minority shareholders' rights, and deal with the corruption issue. They all, on these international lists, they all come in very poorly on all these lists about corruption, use of money, transparency. They're all sort of, out of 180 countries, they come in at about 150 or 140. So they're really not doing very well in terms of the international standards that a country that wants to attract investment is going to have to adhere to. They also have a lot of misuse of funds. You don't know where the funds are going from the Banyads and from other groups, and it's very murky, very opaque. As I say, they have a lot of inflation. So they're going to have to figure out when they decide, or if they decide to reform, what they're going to do. So here are a few ideas that the Iranians themselves have been discussing, but not much progress has been made. One, they have to figure out how to avoid this big gush of money pushing up inflation, because they've had this in the past. People who are familiar with the history of Iran know that when oil prices went up in the 70s, the Shah and his group figured, oh, this is great for Iran. It'll help the Shah, there'll be more prosperity. What happened instead was inflation went up, the rial, the currency went up. There was a lot more focus on the misallocation of resources. And in the end, higher oil prices led to the demise of the Shah, because it focused on corruption, it focused on all these problems of the economy. So this government's quite aware of that. They've had other incidents of a similar nature. So they have to utilize the funds effectively so they don't convey to the people that they're using them poorly or throwing all this windfall money away. Second, they have to avoid inflation. Third, they have to figure out a way of avoiding a big increase in the value of the rial, the currency, because if they do, domestic products become less competitive in global markets. And they have to deal with the corruption issue in general. Most Iranians understand there's corruption. All the indicators by the World Bank and others have focused on this, so Iranians are aware of it. The question is, how do you deal with it? And the government itself is aware of this, because they see that it does lead to discontent among the people when they're aware of it to the extent they are. Then they have to deal with some other more fundamental things, one of which is they have to build up the energy infrastructure. This is a big problem because they have really not had enough money to invest in the energy sector because the energy sector has been under sanctions and they couldn't buy sophisticated equipment. Well, now they can. They don't have refining capacity at all. They have to import refined oil, and so they're going to have to build their refining capacity. But the other thing they realize, and Rouhani is a very smart guy. I mean, they have very talented people. We can dislike their policies all we want, but you cannot underestimate the quality of the people who are engaged in certain aspects of governance. And one of them is economics, where they have very talented people, so they know the problem. And one of the problems is that they can't grow just by investing more in the energy sector. They have to allow more investment to take place in other sectors of the economy to strengthen the diversification, to strengthen the inclusivity of the economy. And this is going to be, I think, a big challenge. The other thing they have to do is deal with this ownership issue, because if foreigners are wary of who owns or has shares in a company, and they're wary of the fact that if they buy into a company where someone is on the SDN list, the names list that I mentioned earlier, even though they may not know it at the outset, there is a liability, a vulnerability to American sanctions. You have to do a lot of work before you make investments, before you trade with companies. So it's not so easy to do that work, but companies are going to try to figure out how to do it, and they'll probably figure it out, particularly with respect to the Revolutionary Guards. There's another debate going on, and that is there is an actual ongoing public debate between the supreme leader and Rouhani, President Rouhani, on whether they ought to cut back the role of the Revolutionary Guard, in part because they're not great managers of many of the companies they own. In some companies, they're very good managers. In other companies, they're not very good managers. So the argument is you cut back on the role of the Revolutionary Guard and put good management into some of these companies. And also, if you want foreign investment, you're probably not going to get it in a company that is visibly and significantly owned by either the Guard or members of the Guard. So there's been a debate, and even the Supreme Leader has made suggestions that the role of the Guard should be cut back. It's not clear that he has done much about it, but it's something that's aired in public. And the fact that the Supreme Leader talked about an economic issue, which is very rare, mostly he talks about religious issues and foreign policy issues, as I say, particularly about the United States, but other countries as well. This is something that I think is interesting. It shows that they're having, and again, it demonstrates it's not a monolithic country. There are debates over some of these issues if you dig down deeply into Iranian politics. So this debate is ongoing. It remains to be seen whether the Guards are going to continue to play as big a role as they have in the past. But it's certainly important to look at because it does affect investment, it does affect management. So to bring this to a conclusion, I've just tried to very quickly go through a wide range of the very complicated issues that the Iranian government faces and that investors face. It's impossible to predict the direction in which Iranian politics will go, but it is possible to look at this country and come to some conclusions because the demographics are very interesting, and the young people of Iran are very eager to become part of the world again. They're very savvy. They have Facebook there. They have Twitter. They have all these social media things, and they use them. Now, to a certain degree, they're not condoned by the government, but people are able to do this. Even the Supreme Leader uses social media. They're not American companies, but they are Iranian companies that use the same kind of technology. So there's a lot of communication among Iranians. They use social media actually quite vigorously. And young people, when the deal was signed, when the nuclear deal, the JCPOA, was agreed upon, there were massive demonstrations in the streets. And I remember going on to a TV show and someone said, well, the fact that there's so many demonstrators there indicates that the Iranians think they've scored a big victory over the United States. I said, it's absolutely the other way around. Look at who's demonstrating. These are kids in their 20s and 30s. Why are they demonstrating? They're demonstrating because they think this is an opportunity for them to engage more with the outside world, that the sanctions will be removed, there'll be more trade, there'll be more investment, there'll be more jobs, they can travel, they can go to school in the United States or go to school in Europe. Americans will be able to go to school in Iran. When I was in the government in the 70s, tells you how long ago I was in government, I used to go to Iran. There were 50,000 Americans living and working in Iran. There were Iranian students in every major university here. There were American students in universities in Iran. All that's dried up, and they remember that, and they want to reinstill in the culture of the country a much greater degree of internationalism. So they want these reforms to work. They want the nuclear agreement to succeed because they feel they can get more jobs from investment, but also because they want to be part of the outside world and talk to young people in Europe and the United States and elsewhere. They admire American culture, they admire American entrepreneurialism, they admire American innovation. They want to be part of this. So we shouldn't forget the demographics of the country. America is going to play a very limited role for the reasons I mentioned. For most Americans, the sanctions are still on. They can't trade with Iran. They can't invest in Iran. They can't do much. It'll be very incremental. But Europe can do more. And Europe, you see European delegations. A friend of mine was in Dubai. He said there are 10 fully loaded Airbuses that go back and forth between Dubai and Tehran every day, full of people. Now, the people who are in those are relatively fewer Americans, but they're from all over. They're from the Gulf, including Sunni Muslims who want to trade. Dubai's been a big trading link to Iran for some time, but it's not just Dubai. There are Africans, there are Canadians, there are Europeans, there are Asians. China has been there for a long time. China really didn't, for the most part, pull out. They pulled back a little bit, but they were still there. So there's going to be much more business, or at least a lot of people trying to do business. Whether they can figure out all the complicated elements that will enable them to do business is a big challenge. But I think that from an American point of view, to the extent American companies are there and support the private sector and interact with the private sector, that at the margin helps the reform process. And I think it's very important also that we implement our part of the JCPOA, that we continue to reduce and eliminate the sanctions that are called for removal under the JCPOA, which I say is not a lot, assuming the Iranians do what they're supposed to do on their side. The notion that some candidates have that we'll just tear up the agreement once they get to be president, if they do get to be president, would be a very serious negative blow for the reformers in Iran who think that this will enable them to get closer to the United States. But the other thing it would do is there'd be a huge confrontation with our allies, because the allies now like this deal, all the P5+1 other than the United States, they're now in there full bore trading, investing, or at least trying to trade and invest. So you'd have a very difficult time with what we call in the United States sort of casually snapback, or the snapback of the sanctions. It'd be very hard to get them to snap back or get any other country to agree to that snapback. The United States government administration has argued for this and said, well, if the Iranians don't adhere to the agreement, we can snap back the sanctions. I think it would be very difficult to do. But if the United States doesn't implement our part of the deal and the Iranians have implemented theirs, then the rest of the world will say, well, the Americans negotiated a deal and pulled back from it. That would be a problem, undermine the reformers in Iran and undermine our relations with the other allies. We can't be naive about Iran. There are plenty of Iranians who don't like us. There are plenty of Iranians who like the support for Hezbollah. They support the Houthis in Yemen. They're doing a lot of things in that area, supporting groups that are, in the United States terminology, either terrorist or at least highly disruptive. There are the missile tests, for instance, where just after we'd removed some of the sanctions under JCPOA, a couple of days later, because of these ballistic missile tests, the president put on new sanctions that were related not to the nuclear issue, but to the missile issue. So there are going to be a lot of tensions. This is not a one-way street to a perfect normal relationship. There are going to be a lot of bumps in the road. And I think we can't expect change to occur immediately or even quickly. But if you look at the demographics and you look at the opportunity we have All the kinds of positive things that people are projecting may not happen at all. The government may continue, or the regime may continue to take very tough actions that the United States has to respond to, that the Gulf Arabs, the Sunni Arabs, begin to take a tougher line against Iran. There are a whole range of things that can happen that can lead to a lot of turbulence and a lot of friction, even with the nuclear agreement. But it seems to me that we have an opportunity, and some may say the opportunity is not going to lead to anything, but at least we have, which we have not had for several decades, an opportunity to move toward a somewhat more normal relationship with this country, to engage more with this country, to try to be responsive, particularly to younger people in the country, in Iran, who want to be part of the global system. We can't do a lot because our economic ties are going to be limited and our foreign policy relations are going to be tense for a period of time, but at least it's an opportunity that the world has and the United States has to enhance the process of normalization over a period of time. And if that works, and even if it's a long shot, it's probably worth the chance and the opportunity. So thank you very much.